There was a girl who lived in a secluded mountain village. Every morning, she embarked on a hike through the winding trails, her best friend, a feisty fox she'd rescued as a cub, at her side. One morning, they veered off the usual path and found themselves in a place entirely unknown to her. From the distance, she spotted an unusual formation against the rocky mountain face. Upon closer examination, she realized it was a large stone door embedded into the mountainside. Etched on it, in what appeared to be red moss, was a chilling warning. "Do not disturb the sleeping giant." Tales of a mythical sleeping giant nestled deep within the mountains were whispered amongst the villagers. Legends claimed that the giant was a guardian of an ancient treasure. The girl was naturally inquisitive and wondered what could be behind the door. Why would there be a warning? Disregarding the cautionary words, she decided to unveil the mystery behind the door that very day. As the sun rose high in the sky, she found herself standing before the stone door. The moss-red inscription stood out starkly against the gray stone. Beneath it, another message, in the same mossy letters. "Do not enter." Without hesitation, she pressed her palms against the cold stone door. With a grinding noise that echoed off the mountains, the door creaked open. Inside, the air was cool and musty. On the cavernous wall, she saw an image of a formidable, sleeping giant. Beside it, in the same mossy letters, was another warning. "Do not wake the giant." Despite the warnings, she ventured further. Her footsteps echoed throughout the cavern as she made her way deeper. Eventually, she reached an ancient stone staircase leading downwards. On the first step, there was another message. "Do not descend these steps." She shrugged off the warning and began her descent. The stairs were uneven and cold under her feet, each step sending eerie echoes through the cavern. At the bottom, she faced a gigantic stone slab. On it, in the same mossy letters, "Do not move this stone." But what did the girl do? She pushed the stone. Inch by inch, it moved until it revealed a hidden chamber. It took a few moments for her eyes to adjust to the dimness. A colossal figure lay in the middle of the room, covered with an enormous blanket made of moss and leaves. Once again, a warning in moss-red letters was inscribed. "Do not uncover the giant." Curiosity getting the better of her, the girl carefully moved the leafy blanket. With a heart pounding with excitement and apprehension, she revealed the giant and saw a mountain of colorful gumdrops. I wrote the most terrifying story ever. It's probably too dangerous to read. I've wanted to be a horror writer since I first blew through 60 Goosebumps books in elementary school. As I got older, my interest quickly shifted to Christopher Pike and then Stephen King and Dean Koontz. At first, my parents were thrilled that I was reading it all, but when my mom started catching on to exactly what I was reading, she got worried. "You're going to give yourself nightmares," she said, but I basically laughed in her face. Nothing scared me. It was all silly. Even Pennywise in it or Randall Flagg in The Stand just seemed like cartoons to me. At some point, I decided the only way to discover something genuinely scary was to write it myself. Of course, I went through all of the common pitfalls of a rookie writer, copying my idols, generating page after page of drivel. It wasn't until college that I actually started coming up with stories that didn't stink like hot garbage. Finally, when I was a senior, I wrote the first one that I was actually proud of. It was about a space station that ran out of food, and rescue is years away. The chief scientist calculates that he'll have just enough calories to make it in time if he eats the rest of the crew. I was so excited to finally show it to someone that I emailed it to my girlfriend and asked her to tell me what she thought. I sent the email and then drove over to her place so I could hear her reaction in person. When I got there, she was in tears. I asked her if she liked the story, and she said that she couldn't even look at me, that I was disgusting. I told her to relax. It was just a story after all, but she just started screaming that there was something wrong with me and that I needed to get out of her house right then. It was sad to lose her, but it didn't change how I felt about the story. I ended up sending it to a few magazines, but I didn't hear back. I guess I figured that it wasn't scary enough. And if I'm going to be honest, a bit of self-doubt was beginning to creep in. Maybe there was something wrong with me. Maybe some kind of gauge had broken inside of me such that my whole concept of terror was different from the rest of humanity. Maybe I should just stop writing and get an office job. A couple of months after that, I was lying awake at night when I felt something heavy on my chest. I looked down to see what was sitting there, but all I could make out was a shadow. "You're close," it said. "You can't hold back now." I woke up gasping. Of course, I took it as a sign. I started my next story that very morning. And if I'm going to be honest, this one felt different than anything I'd written before. It was like the monster I was writing about was embracing me from behind, curling its fingers around mine, guiding them on the keyboard. Then, it was like I blinked, and the whole thing was already written out on the page, a couple thousand words. I scrolled up in my doc, and it was like I was reading it for the first time. And as I went, I actually felt my body tensing, my pulse quickening, all of the stuff I'd read about in novels but never actually experienced myself. I was actually afraid. Shaking, I quickly shut my computer screen. It was immediately apparent to me that I'd written a story scarier than anything I'd ever read, and since I'd read practically everything, there was a good chance it was the scariest story ever created. My first thought was to post it somewhere online for maximum exposure. I was just about to post it online when I hesitated. Maybe it would be better to run it by a few test readers first. I hadn't even really done a proper grammar check, after all. That afternoon, I went to my parents' house with a few printouts of the story. My parents were glad to see me, of course, but a little wary of reading my story. They exchanged a funny look but ultimately agreed to give it a look. I waited downstairs as they each went to their upstairs study to read in the coziest chairs. The seconds ticked by painfully. I couldn't wait to hear what they thought. I imagined their pride as they realized that not only was their son a real writer, but that he'd actually written the scariest story ever. And then I heard a shattering of glass, followed by a thump. I ran outside to find my mother's body in a heap surrounded by fragments of the upstairs window as well as my manuscript pages. I ran to her, trying to shake her awake, but found her completely lifeless. I was about to call 911 when I looked up and saw my father standing at the same window. He was shaking with fear as he picked a piece of broken glass from the window and ran it across his throat. Then, as the blood trickled down his neck, he fell lifelessly down, landing with a thump on top of my mom. I guess I should have been scared, but if I'm going to be honest, the sight of my dead parents was practically a walk in the park compared to the story. I felt sad seeing them like that, but not like I needed to scream bloody murder or anything. A bloody page blew out from under my mother's corpse and clung to my chest. I pulled it slowly off my body, and as I did, I reread one of the sentences. A chill ran through me. My whole body was shaking, and I fell to my knees. I felt like the words were looking at me, seeing something deep and rotten inside. I felt like the words would eat me down to my disgusting bones. I felt that if I read even one more word, I'd have the same uncontrollable urge they felt, that I'd want to walk upstairs and leap from that very same window. And even though I knew the story was the best, that it was the scariest, and that it was mine, I didn't want to read it anymore. That was all a couple of weeks ago. Since then, I've been trying to decide what to do about the story. Part of me knows that if I put it out there, people would finally recognize my talent. Maybe I'd be getting calls of congratulations from King and Pike and R.L. Stein and all my idols, praising my talent, begging me to write more. Or maybe a bunch of people would end up like my parents. But if I'm going to be honest, the main thing stopping me from posting it is the risk. The risk that I'd accidentally read a couple of sentences and feel the fear again, that inescapable dark bubbling from somewhere deep and unknowable. It's that thing I thought I was chasing all along, but when I finally found it, I broke. I'm working on my mom's laptop for now, so I don't have to open the one with the story. But I know I can't just let it sit there forever, unread. It would be like keeping the Mona Lisa in a dark basement, away from all human eyes, right? Anyway, thanks for listening. I appreciate any advice you can provide. In a small town, a young boy found himself alone for the evening. His parents, heading out, gave him strict instructions to be in bed by 10 p.m. They promised they'd be back past midnight and warned him sternly that he'd better not be awake when they arrived. Caught up in the immersive world of his novel, the boy didn't realize the late hour until his eyes happened to glance at the clock, 11:06 p.m. His heart pounded as he remembered his parents' warning. He was about to make a mad dash for the bathroom to prepare for bed when the sharp trill of the phone startled him. The boy hesitated, assuming it was his parents calling to check on him. Finally, he picked up the phone, putting on a well-practiced yawn before greeting the caller. "Hello?" An unfamiliar male voice greeted him back. "Hello. Have you received a threatening letter?" The boy, startled, replied, "I don't think so. Could you please check? We'll call back in 5 minutes." The call ended abruptly, leaving the boy feeling anxious and perplexed. Why would anyone send him a threatening letter? His heart pounded even harder as he considered the cryptic way the caller had used. He frantically dialed his parents' cell numbers, only to be met with voicemail. The phone rang again, causing the boy to jump. He picked it up. "Did you find the letter?" the voice asked. "I haven't looked yet," the boy's voice trembled. "Then get to it," the voice ordered, sounding more ominous. "You think it's going to read itself? We'll call back in 5 minutes." The boy scoured the apartment, looking everywhere a letter might be, but he found nothing. This pattern repeated itself: the phone calls, the demanding voice, the fruitless searches. Finally, the caller admitted, "Maybe we've got the wrong address." With a laugh that sent shivers down his spine, the caller ended the conversation. Despite the unease, the boy was relieved. His parents would be home soon and he needed to be in bed. He rushed through his bedtime routine and jumped into bed, heart still pounding. Just as he was on the cusp of sleep, he thought he heard the front door open and close softly, followed by faint footsteps. His heart pounded once more, but sleep overtook him before he could investigate. When his parents returned home after midnight, they were met with an unthinkable sight. Their son lay lifeless in his bed, a threatening letter tightly clutched in his hand. His mother let out a wail. The phone rang. His father picked it up, his face pale. "Hello," said the now familiar voice. "Did you find the letter?" In a sprawling metropolis, a young woman named Lily found herself battling against the odds as an aspiring artist. She scraped by on her savings and occasional commission work, barely managing to cover her bills. The only workspace she could afford was an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district of the city, a far cry from the lofty and chic studios her peers occupied. The warehouse, a behemoth of the city's forgotten past, was grungy, dimly lit, and in dire need of repair. Dust was layered so thickly it had become a carpet, and the walls, adorned with chipped paint, exuded an atmosphere of melancholic decay. But to Lily, it was a canvas of opportunity. Days turned into nights as Lily lost herself in creating art. One night, while taking a break from her work, she noticed an irregularity in one of the walls, a small, almost unnoticeable door that she had overlooked in her initial sweep. Pushing past the rusted hinges, the door gave way to a dark tunnel, extending further than she could see. The next night, under the cloak of darkness, she saw a group of ominous men entering her warehouse carrying large, peculiar bags, proceeding towards the hidden door. Intrigued yet apprehensive, Lily watched as they disappeared into the secret tunnel. She followed at a safe distance, curiosity overpowering her fear. Suddenly, she witnessed a sight that froze her blood. In the dim tunnel light, one of the men drew a knife and mercilessly stabbed another. The air filled with helpless cries, quickly muffled and replaced by a deadly silence. The men, unfazed, efficiently disposed of the body and departed, leaving Lily alone with the horrifying truth. She rushed back to her workspace, her mind a whirlpool of panic and disbelief. She wanted to report what she saw, but the realization that she would be putting her life at risk paralyzed her. She was also cognizant of the fact that her discovery of the tunnel could raise questions about her involvement. A week went by. Each day, Lily returned to the warehouse, constantly looking over her shoulder, haunted by the act of violence she'd witnessed. She even tried to block the secret door, hoping to forget what lay beyond it. One day, the local newspaper carried a headline about an unidentified man's body found in a nearby river. The man was suspected to be a victim of an unresolved dispute between local criminal factions. The police were still investigating, but they had no leads on the killer. That night, a haunting sound echoed from the direction of the secret door, the same muffled groans she heard the night of the murder. It was impossible. The warehouse was locked, and only she had the key. The hidden door was blocked. Yet, there it was, the undeniable proof of someone, in the tunnel. Summoning her courage, Lily slowly approached the door, moving the blockade. The groaning ceased, replaced by a thick, impenetrable silence. With trembling hands, she opened the door and peered into the darkness of the tunnel. At first, she saw nothing but an inky blackness. But then, as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something, a faint glint of light reflecting off something in the tunnel. Then she saw it. An eye, wide and bloodshot, staring directly back at her. Lily stumbled backward, a scream stuck in her throat. The haunting eye seemed to bore into her very soul. She was about to run when a raspy voice broke the silence. "I know what you saw, artist." After being out of work for nearly a year, I was relieved when I got a call from the local school district. They needed an English teacher, starting immediately. The salary was surprisingly high for a small town school, and the administration seemed desperate. "You're assigned to classroom 0, they said. I had never heard of a classroom labeled as 0 before, but I didn't think much of it. The old, colonial-style school was situated in a quiet part of town. Its red brick walls and Gothic architecture exuded an eerie charm, but the constant silence gave me the creeps. On my first day, I couldn't help but notice the hush that hung in the air, despite the school being in session. As I walked down the narrow corridor, a janitor pointed me to a wooden door at the end. Above it, carved into the wood, was Classroom 0. With a strange feeling brewing inside me, I opened the door to my new classroom. Inside, I was met by a room full of children, their faces lit up with an uncanny enthusiasm. They were all dressed oddly for the 21st century, more like they belonged in a different era. Some were wearing the flapper dresses of the 1920s, while others sported clothing I'd only seen in vintage photos from the early 1900s. The strangeness didn't stop there. The students never left the classroom. They didn't need bathroom breaks, never went to the cafeteria for lunch, and I never saw them in the hallways. Most unsettling of all, they never aged. The students who wore turn-of-the-century clothing spoke in archaic English. They referred to the modern technologies I mentioned as futuristic wonders. The reality struck me one afternoon when, during a creative writing class, one of my students, a girl named Lillian, wrote a story about her house. The architecture, the surrounding landscape, her parents' attire, it all seemed straight out of the late 1800s. On questioning, she revealed she went missing while playing in the woods near her home. She'd been here, in Classroom 0, ever since. In my spare time, I started researching the town's history. It wasn't long before I came across countless stories of children disappearing over the past century. When I matched the names from the town's records with my student list, my heart stopped. Each child in my class was a missing child from the town's past. From that day forward, I was obsessed with freeing them from their limbo state. We started an extra lesson each day, exploring the nature of their existence and discussing theories of spirits, parallel universes, and time anomalies. I contacted paranormal experts, child psychologists, historians, and even physicists. Then one day, as we pondered over a theoretical physics book, a student, a boy named Charlie, suggested that their energy might be trapped in the school, specifically in Classroom 0, due to an event horizon of sorts, an intersection of space and time, caught in a loop. If we could disrupt the loop, they might be set free. The idea was fantastical, but we were out of options. We decided to perform a release ceremony. Each child wrote a letter to their loved ones, describing their time in Classroom 0 and their longing to be free. We buried the letters under a 100-year-old oak tree near the school. That night, as I sat in Classroom 0, I felt a sudden gust of wind even though the windows were closed. The room became chill, and the blackboard rattled. And then silence fell again. I turned around and found the classroom empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed to the schoolyard. The ground where we had buried the letters was undisturbed. The next morning, I walked into an empty Classroom 0. As the days turned into weeks, no children appeared. The class was disbanded, the room repurposed. There was no record of a Classroom 0 existing in the school's files, and when I brought it up, people looked at me strangely, as if I was recounting a dream. But I know what happened. I keep the classroom key as proof, a small piece of reality from a larger, unbelievable truth. The school moved on, the stories of missing children became folktales. But every once in a while, I visit the old oak tree, remembering the innocent souls who once filled Classroom 0, praying they finally found their way home. It was the fall of 2023, and I had just transferred to Mortimer Academy, a private high school nestled away in the cozy town of Marshfield. I was still trying to familiarize myself with the campus, the teachers, the students, and of course, the school legends. Mortimer Academy's sports team, the Marching Marshes, was notorious for its undefeated streak, and the team's mascot, a giant frog suit named Frogbert, was at the heart of its reputation. But there was something eerily peculiar about Frogbert that sent chills down my spine. Rumor had it that anyone who donned the Frogbert costume on the night of the championship game would mysteriously disappear without a trace right after the game. This strange phenomenon was rumored to have been going on for years, but being new to town, I took it with a grain of salt. As time went on, however, the unsettling tale became more and more palpable. The school would never talk about it openly, but whispers in the hallways, hushed conversations, and fearful glances towards the trophy case that housed the mascot costume were too conspicuous to ignore. The championship game was approaching, and the school was abuzz. I couldn't help but feel an odd mixture of excitement and dread as the day grew nearer. And then, the unthinkable happened. On the morning of the game, our mascot, who was also my new best friend, Pete, was nowhere to be found. Panic set in, and the school decided that a substitute was needed. And I, being the new guy and not yet aware of the gravity of the situation, was chosen. I was both terrified and thrilled. I tried to convince myself it was all a silly school legend. The championship game went by in a blur. We won, as was expected. I, inside Frogbert, danced, cheered, and made the crowd laugh. But as the euphoria died down and the crowd started to disperse, an eerie silence took over. Once everyone had left, I found myself alone in the empty locker room. With a heavy sigh, I unzipped the back of the Frogbert suit. I was engulfed by a chilling coldness, like plunging into a winter lake. My skin tingled and everything went dark. I woke up to find myself lying in the middle of the empty football field. The suit was gone. I looked around but saw no one. I walked back to the locker room, it was undisturbed, the Frogbert suit nowhere in sight. I ran to Pete's house, hoping he might be there, but it was empty. It was as if he had never existed. His parents had no recollection of him, and his room was transformed into a study. I returned to the school the next day, but no one remembered Pete, and everyone acted like I was the mascot all along. There was no sign of Frogbert in the trophy case, only a small plaque that read, "In memory of the forgotten mascots." Desperate, I visited the town's library and dug into the archives. Old newspaper clippings confirmed my fears. Every year, there were reports of students vanishing following the championship game. They were all the school's mascots. Terrified, I tried to leave town, but something inexplicable kept me here. It's as if an unseen force has tied me to this place. My family seems to have forgotten our plans to move, and my messages to my old friends are left unread. So here I am, stuck in this town, stuck in a loop, a prisoner of Frogbert's curse. Every night, I go to sleep hoping to wake up from this nightmare. But every morning, I find myself back in the same room, in the same town, facing the same school building, and the same trophy case without Frogbert. If you're reading this, remember me and all those who've been forgotten. The mascots who cheered, danced, and brought joy, only to disappear, swallowed by the very spirit they embodied. So, if ever you pass by Mortimer Academy and see a new kid wearing the mascot suit, cheer for him. For he may just be the next victim of the mascot's curse, about to take his last dance before being erased from existence.